The World of RPGs, Episode 15, Germany, Part 1 of 3. Welcome to The World of RPGs, a podcast in which we travel around the globe and learn about the local role-playing game scenes. I'm your host Mo Baltz, and in Episode 15 we are going to Germany. This is the episode I feared to do at the beginning of this podcast because I knew it would take a long time and hold me up. It's also the episode most requested by other interviewees. This one was the easiest and hardest to produce. The easiest because I was born and raised in Germany, so I know the language and it was easy to reach out to people. The hardest for the same reason. There's just too much to cover and I had to make a multi-parter out of this. I split this episode into Part 1, an introduction and a history of German games. Part 2, major translated game lines and their German adaptations. Plus we talk a bit about representation and sustainability in gaming. And Part 3, German indie games. This episode took over 2 months to produce, not only because unlike the usual 3 to 4 interviews I do, I had 12 for this one. There were also business trips, including to Germany, a broken laptop, which just yesterday totally broke down, some more, a move to the other side of the street, and I eventually did most of the editing on vacation while sitting in a small hut with no internet access and eventually no running water. As I guess there will be some new listeners this episode, let's have a short overview of how I do these. I start with an introduction where I talk about my connection to the country and give a short overview of the culture. Then I have a bunch of interviews with role players from that country or people who are experts on that culture. This includes players, game masters, translators of games, authors, podcasters, convention organizers, publishers, and more. In this episode, for example, we'll add prop makers to the list. After the interviews, I give some shout-outs and recommendations, and we end with a short excerpt of an actual play in the language of the next episode. Since this is a 3-parter, I will do these last things at the end of Part 3. So Germany is one of the countries with the oldest TTRPG scenes, as you will hear in this part. Almost all major English language TTRPGs and a fair number of French and Swedish ones have been translated into German. I will not even list those since it would take up half of the episode. There are also many local games, and again it would take hours upon hours to describe all of them. Just to list some of the major ones in rough chronological order, the classic German games are Midgard and Das Schwarze Auge, followed in the late 1980s and early 1990s by Ruf des Warlock, Private Eye, Plüsch Power und Plunder, Space Gothic, and Karma. After 2000, we get Engel, De Genesis, Arcane Codex, Lotland from my hometown, Illyrion, Ratten, Dungeon Slayers, Opus Anima, Heredium, Justifiers, Malmsturm, Splittermond, Hexen 1733, No Return, Tagen, Dieseldrachen, and many more. I'm leaving out a lot of current smaller games because we cover these in the interviews. License settings include RPGs based on the German dime novel series Perry Rodin, which we'll address in one of the first interviews, and Geisterjäger John Sinclair. There's also, weirdly enough, a Chronicle of Narnia RPG in German. As far as I know, of these German games, Das Schwarze Auge, Engel, and De Genesis have been translated into English. Furthermore, games like Call of Cthulhu, The Old World of Darkness with Vampire and Changeling, Shadowrun, and Space 1889 have had unique supplements for the German market, and you'll hear more about them in Part 2. Now let's get a short overview of the country because it will be important to understand the role-playing scene. Germany has a population of about 82 million people and the country is organized as a federal republic, meaning that it's rather decentralized. The country was split into a capitalist West and communist East from 1949 to 1990, with Berlin, which is geographically in the East, again being split into 2 parts. When we later talk about the development of the gaming scene, you'll notice that the first conventions, game shops, and publishers mostly were in the west and northwest of the country and not in Berlin. Germany is also split among religions and dialects. You can roughly say that Germans are about 30% Roman Catholic, mostly in the south and west, 30% Lutheran Protestant, mostly in the north and east, 10% other religions, and 30% agnostic and atheist. Unlike in the USA, in Germany it's rather mainstream to be openly atheist, but at the same time you might also play with a student from a theological seminary. The German language is a Western Germanic language, but it has diverged quite a bit from its neighbors like English or Dutch. Dialects vary quite a bit. For example, Northern German is rather close to Dutch, but written German is always the same. We'll discuss this more when we come to other German-speaking countries. Now to the interviews. According to tradition, we start with the person who did the actual play in the teaser that we had in the last episode.
My name is Jens Ballerstedt. I'm 50 years old and I'm owner and founder of the Lurch and Lama role-playing stream community shop, Lurch und Lama. I'm in the role-playing business now since the mid-90s. I started role-playing in the 80s, 1986. When I was a small child, a friend of me took me to a store in Düsseldorf, a town nearby where I grew up. And there was a shop of a guy who invented a game named Das Schwarze Auge, the Dark Eye. And there I was introduced into this wonderful hobby of escapism, and I never left. In the 90s, I started writing for Shadowrun, 3rd edition and 4th edition. And I started the first kind of marketing in role-playing in these days for FanPro, Fantasy Productions, who were a big player in Europe in the 90s and the early 2000s. And this is where I came from.
And which games do you currently play?
Too much. For the last 4 years, we had 2 campaigns for Pathfinder, a 2nd edition. And currently I play quite unknown game called Batch Quest. It's by DM Dave, and you play scouts, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, to sell cookies and fight monsters. I play Hexen, which is some kind of Brothers Grimm Van Helsing-like role-playing game, which plays in the Baroque in Germany, and many more.
And before we come to your website and the actual play, my biggest question is, how did you get this name, Lurch and Lama? So Lurch is like an amphibian, like a salamander lizard thing.
It's some kind of a lizard. When Saskia, who is the Lurch and I'm the Lama, when Saskia and I founded our company, we thought about how should we call ourselves. And there are many communities who have war fighting like names. They call battle giants and dungeon fighters and things like that. Everything is in a real cruel way. And we wanted to found a place, a community for friendly people who like to play with each other. And we think this starts with a label. And so when we talked about it, we used Telegram to write to each other, and we used stickers. And each time I invented a name, the Lurch posted a lizard icon with a lizard who just sticked out the tongue, like, this is rubbish. And in the end, I said, well, why don't we take this? Because I always posted a llama. And this is just coincidence. And in the end, we asked our friends several names, and all with a background. We want to be friendly, cozy, and a nice community, warm-hearted community. And in the end, everyone voted for Lurch und Lama. And so we took this.
Yeah, I mean, from a marketing point of view, which is the subject that I teach at university, it stands out in the gaming community.
This is the part which I would like to call myself brilliant, but it was just a coincidence. The positive effect is everyone who listens to the name is smiling, and you have a positive emotion when you talk about us because it sounds nice and funny. And the next thing is you asked me why we called us this way, which makes me explain it, which makes you listen to me, and so you will not forget us. I would really, really like to call me brilliant, but it was a coincidence.
Now, let's go on to the site. So you have an online shop, not a physical one. Is that right?
Yeah, Lurch and Llama consists of several parts. One part is the online shop. The other part is our Twitch and YouTube. And the third part is our Discord community with about 1,500 role-playing gamers. And the fourth part, which is not seen so much, is that we are marketing providers for smaller role-playing companies who cannot afford to do their own marketing.
So let's start with the shop. Can you maybe give an overview which games are the most popular ones?
As we did a Pathfinder campaign on Twitch for the last 4 years, Pathfinder is quite popular because people who look our streams find us, come to our shop. People who like Pathfinder look our streams, so this is just as it goes. Then Shadowrun and Cthulhu is also quite popular. And I don't want to take out one system, we have a community that is quite interested in niche games. So we have a lot of small role-playing games, like I said, Batch Quest, that we sell quite often. And from our European customers, not the customers that sit in Germany, Mörkborg is really popular, which is from Sweden.
Yes. I recently had the chance to see the physical copy for the first time. It's quite impressive. But we're not doing the Sweden episode. So let's have a look at some of the German products you have. So I've talked in another interview about Das Schwarze Auge and Midgard in a lot of detail. So we don't have to focus on these. You already mentioned the Hexen 1733. Can you maybe shortly say something about that one?
Yes. It's quite popular in Germany, and it's starting to reach the dark eye in popularity. In Germany, on the first place, selling-wise, is D&D. On the second place, there's Das Schwarze Auge. And on the third place, there's Hexen and Cthulhu. Hexen is quite new compared to the other role-playing games. It plays in the year 1733. And the story is that in the year 1640, a couple of Swedish mercenaries in the 30-Year War, they took shelter in a small monastery in the Blackwood in Germany. And they found some kind of grave, opened it, and the grave was a tunnel to hell. So they opened the gates of hell, and all the demons, and I mean all the classic demons, like Asmodeus, like Shaitan and Leviathan, all the classic Bible demons, they came to Earth and conquered most of it. So nearly 100 years later, the humans have taken back some part of the world. They reconquered a lot of it. They reconquered Rome and other big cities and are starting to fight the demons. And you play witch hunters, as they are called, Hexenjäger in German, witch hunters in English. And you have special abilities and fight against the forces of hell to liberate Earth from these dark creatures. And the end goal of it would be to close this gate again, but no one has reached this gate in the last 100 years. So nobody knows if it's possible.
I think this was one of the first big crowdfunding campaign in the German market, wasn't it?
Yes, there were others, but this was the first big new game. There were crowdfundings for The Dark Eye before that were also quite successful. But this was one of the first crowdfundings that established a new game on the German market. And well, from all the games that went through crowdfundings in Germany, I think this is the most successful.
Yeah, I was in Germany 2 weeks ago in Bielefeld and Dortmund. Went to the game shops there and I considered if I should buy it. And then I saw they already have like 6 or 8 supplements. And I thought, that's way too much. Yeah.
More like that. What they do is each year on Halloween, there is the next wave of Hexen books. They started off by the core rules, and they then went to a campaign and several other playing options for the hunters. And the last one, I think, I'm sure, was Britain. So they've done something about what happened in this clash in Great Britain. Quite interesting because Britain disappeared. So it just went lost and came back just a few years ago. Nobody knew where Great Britain was. It was in the lands of the fairies. They departed Great Britain to protect it from the demons.
Yeah, I'll have to see if I can find an online group to play this, to try this out.
You can find one on the Lurch and Lama Discord because you talk German. And we also have some English-speaking Hexen groups on our Discord. So if you come there, you will for sure find something for Hexen newbies to just have a look in the system. We have several of the authors of this role-playing game doing play rounds on our Discord.
And the rules, I had a look at the core book. To me, it looked like a classical 1990s game on the first look.
Not really, just on the first look. Rule-wise, it oriented itself on MMOs, the online role-playing games. So you have functions that you have to fill, like the tank, the damage dealer, the healer, the supporter, stuff like that. And you have to have a well-balanced group to succeed in the world of Hexen. It's a D6 pool system, like Shadowrun, but with some special dice. You have several kind of D6 to distinguish between several forces you have. It's quite on the action side of a role-playing game. Fast, it's easy. This is what Hexen wants to be. It's not simulating so much. So, for example, in many role-playing games, if you have historic firearms, you will have to shoot and reload. You will have to count your ammunition and stuff like that. Hexen absolutely does nothing of that. It just says, well, you have ammunition enough. It will never be a point that you are reloading because the makers thought, well, who likes to sit beside his friends loading his firearm while for 5 rounds his friends are doing sword fights? And he's just sitting there doing nothing. This is not fun, sitting there doing nothing. You want to be part of the fight. This is why they did it in this way. They said, we get loose of everything that is not fun.
I had a look at the website concerning other German games, and it's a bit difficult to know because some of them are translations from English.
Yeah, I can give some examples. One of the role-playing games that origined in Germany and is not yet on our shop, but we supported the crowdfunding and it's right now in production, is a game called No Return, which is some kind of post-apocalyptic, dark future role-playing game. And you're right, many role-playing games in Germany are translations, not only from English. For example, we have Troubleshooters, which is a translation from Swedish/French. It's a really nice game which plays in the world of the Franco-Belgian comics like Tim and Struppi and Tintin and things like that, which is a really, really fun game. My partner, the Lurch, really loves that game. It's wonderful. These are examples for games that are published by smaller companies in Germany. And we have the Donnerhaus company. They sit in Berlin and they have a total different approach to role-playing products because they don't bring books but game boxes and they totally focus on the story. So one box is one gaming experience. You have a story with fitting rules and fitting characters, and you play this story in this box, which is quite long. You can play for a year or two in this world. And they've already done the first box, which plays in World War One. But it's not a war role-playing game. It's some kind of mystery role-playing game. It's just the historical setting is World War One, but you play a mystery. And they are about to bring out the second box this year, which will be called Dies Irae, the Days of Wrath. And it plays in Damascus in the year 1100 something. So they will bring out 5 of these boxes. And in the end, after playing all these 5 boxes, you have one story arc starting in the medieval, ending in the future, in several historical episodes, which I think is very, very interesting.
I'm actually going to talk to them next week or in 2 weeks.
Greet them. We've done the crowdfunding together, and we will do the next together. They are doing something which is right now quite popular in the German role-playing community, and that is the possibility of Let's Plays. So during Corona, where all conventions shut down, we had the problem of how do we talk to the community about new games. We can't go to conventions and show them. So there was a grassroots movement of several role-playing Twitches, streamers, YouTubers, Insta accounts, things like that. And the modern role-playing companies now use all of that. It's not only old guys sitting behind a table talking about the game in a dark hall somewhere in a village. We've done huge steps in digitalization in the last years, forced by Corona.
So that is a perfect step to the next topic, and that would be your videos. So you have actual plays, but also like topical videos.
Right. We have some kind of all you need for role-playing channel. We have Let's Plays. We have each month a news stream where we just tell the people what's new in the business, which games were published, which games are announced to come, which we do each month. And we do some kind of editorial, I would call it, because I studied medieval history and linguistics. I'm some kind of guy who wants to talk about his wits. So we do something about how do you live in a medieval village? How were the Christians in the times of the conqueror of Jerusalem? How were the temple knights? All stuff like that. But also, what does it mean to be religious? We had a talk about that because in role-playing game, many people are playing clerics. And nowadays we live in a time where fewer and fewer people are going to church or are even believing in God or something, call it what you like. And so people don't really know how it feels to be religious. So I invited a cleric, a nowadays Roman Catholic cleric, and I talked to him about how does it feel to be religious and what can you do to play a good cleric.
Yeah, maybe one thing for the listeners in Germany, there was never like a satanic panic about role-playing games.
A bit.
Yeah, but okay, maybe I'm too young to it, but not as strong as in other countries. And some role playing clubs meet in churches, and I've played with people who study theology to become priests, Catholic or Protestant. So while in Germany there's a high amount of atheists and agnostics, also on the role-playing scene, who are very open about it, especially compared to the US, you can have the situation that this mostly atheist group is actually playing in the church building. I mean, not in the church hall, but in a church organization like YMCA or something. Or that people who will become priests are actually part of the gaming group. That's not like it happens every day, but it's not unheard of.
We have some of really Christian people in our community who are really practicing their religion, but are role-playing gamers. But there was a Satanic Panic. I remember when I was a child and started off playing role-playing games, we had to go to the school psychologist because we played in school. And we were sent there to talk about what we are doing. It was not so much religious, but they feared that we get in some strange kind of people circle, like Scientology stuff. Yeah.
But let's get back to the channel. So the videos where you play games, the one I used as a teaser for the Germany episode is a Das Schwarze Auge session, which I took because it's a iconic German game. I think it's part of a published adventure, wasn't it?
Right. For Das Schwarze Auge, every month there is a 16-page adventure that is published. And we took one of those. I think you took Hexenreigen. Yeah. And this is one of these 16 pages that is published. And this is one of my favorite of them. It's several years old. And I took this one to play. The adventure is about one male black magic practitioner who just infiltrated a circle of good witches, and you help the good witches to fight him back. I think you took the scene where I just played some magical awoken mushrooms who talked to the adventurers.
I think it was a witch brewing something.
Oh, yes. The old witch. The very old witch. Yeah.
Because it was hard for me to pick something in the other languages when I don't understand them, I just pick something where you hear people rolling dice and people laughing and people being active. And then I also try to make sure that you have female and male voices to show that gaming is for everyone. And here it was harder because I could understand every word. And I was like, okay, where do I exactly stop?
Yeah, this is something which is very important for our channel. We don't have one single Let's Play where you only see male players. Not one. I would rather not play a Let's Play, but do it only by male because I think representation is so important. And if you have some German speaking viewers, we had one talk about women in the role-playing business, where I was not in front of a camera, but five women who are all part of the role-playing community talked about their experiences, how it is to be as a woman in this community. And I think we guys have a long way to go from now. But I think we do some good work there. Quite proud of it.
Okay, we're a bit running out of time. So, is there anything you want to add before I stop the recording?
Yes, there's one thing I don't stop to tell people, and this is that the art of storytelling and escapism is one of the most important human developments we have, because you can form your own reality by telling your own story. And I bring it with an example. If you have a day where you ride home with your bike and you fall and you hurt your knee and stand up and drive back home, if you tell this story and stop your story when you fall, then it's a bad day. because you are hurt and everything's bad. But if you keep on telling your story, then it's a story about winning, because you just get back on your bike, you drive home, nevertheless, then it hurts, you reach home and you succeed. So just think about how you tell the story of your own life, and don't ever stop on the times where you're put down. Just keep on telling, and there will be a day when your story is about winning. And this is one thing I keep on telling everyone I meet. And this is why role-playing games and storytelling is so important and good for your soul.
So, how did TTRPGs come to Germany? Luckily, I was able to talk to someone who was there in the early years.
So my name is Peter Kraft, and I started with role-playing in 1978. As to paraphrase Elrond, I was there 3,000 years ago. Okay, first a bit about the topic. Well, let's start with the SFCD. That's the Science Fiction Club Deutschland, Germany. And it was founded in the 50s, and it was, as everything German those days, pretty serious. Those guys were not fans like we know them today, but they thought they were doing something very important, and there were also some other people who thought there should be fun in the whole thing. And so in 1966, they drank a few beers too many and finally made their own club, which was called Fellowship of the Lords of the Lands of Wonder, Follow. And this club still exists today. It's now going nearly 60 years. It's 58 years now. And so they came together and they all liked playing games. And so they created a game which is called the Eternal Game, das ewige Spiel. And this has been played since 1970 it started. Each year they come together for a week and play that game and write history of that word Maghera. And now we are close to role-playing because those guys in those years were something like very early cosplayers. They built a culture and costumes, and when they come together, I think it's a lot like LARP today, or cosplayers. And so there was one element missing, the living in that world. And then someone went on a pupils exchange to the US, and when he came back, he had learned role-playing. Now, the funny thing is, if you think about 1977, everyone would think D&D. But he came back with M.R. Barker's Empires of the Battle Throne. So the real role-playing started with those rules. And the first real role-playing game took part in New Year's Eve 1977-78. And the game that was played was basically from The Hobbit, when the dwarves and Bilbo go into the Misty Mountains and are captured by the orcs. And that was basically the theme of that game. And that was the first role-playing game ever played in Germany. Now, I talked a bit about the word Maghera and its countries and cultures. And there were Vikings, Indians from continent India, and nearly everything you can imagine. And those cultures were basically perfect to be played in a role-playing game to simulate that. So there were then two venues. One was Abenteuer in Maghera, Adventures in Maghera, which later became Midgard. And the other was Abenteuer in Rannabar, that's the Benin people. And they basically used the Empires of the Battle Throne rules. And I played in both campaigns, funny enough. And so in 1978, the whole thing started. I came to role-playing via, funny enough, Parker game that was Verlies, which was released in 1978. And that was a copy of TSR Dungeon. Dungeon is a, let's say, very simple version of D&D. And that was translated into German. And I started with that. Then I think it was in late 78, I wrote to the Fantasy Club Follow for information material. and I knew nothing at that time, and I received information from them. And so I contacted one of the guys, and that was Ludger Fischer. And he played in the Abenteuer in Magira campaign. And so in Pentecost 79, I went to my first gaming convention. That was in Wuppertal. And that was quite interesting for the time. They had a lot of games. They had WRG rules, that's miniature wargaming, and a huge board with Ogre from Steve Jackson Games, and quite a lot of other stuff. And there I met the people who played Abenteuer in Ranaba, and they were very active in those days. And they invited me to my first real role-playing game that must have been somewhere in, I think, July 79. And I went there, and from then on, things started to get interesting. So let's go back to the technical parts of the games. Everyone in those days used Empires of the Battle Throne, and basically nothing else. But then, it was also in 79, RuneQuest was released, and that was absolutely amazing. If you look at the old role-playing rules like D&D and EBT, they are not very good, to put it this way. And RuneQuest suddenly gave you capabilities in gaming that had not been there before. For example, the rule of riding on a horse or fighting from horseback, where you could really use a lance, and the idea was that the strength of the horse was added to the player's strength, and such that damage became higher. Today, many games use something like that, but that was completely new. That had never before been used. And also the idea of not going into a dungeon, but playing on the surface, going into towns, going into villages. That was all new in those days. When D&D started, it was mostly go into a dungeon, kill the monsters, and grab the treasure. So that was the origin of role-playing games in Germany. Now we come to the commercial part. Up till now, it was purely fandom. There was nothing involved. There were people who liked to play and who liked to design rules. So now let's go to D&D and Das Schwarze Auge. So this is a funny little story. Basically, TSR was looking for people in Germany to translate the rules into German. And they contacted Uli Kiso and Werner Fuchs. And they had a company called Fantasy Productions, which is quite well known today, because they made in the 90s nearly everything from Shadowrun or Battletech. And so they said, okay, we can translate that. They were professional translators. And then came a situation where the company they were working with, that was Schmidt-Spiele, was suddenly booted by another company, which was like us, which basically making card games, manufacturing playing card sets. So Schmidt-Spiele and the translators said, shit, they booted us. Now what are we going to do? So Werner or Uli, I don't know who it was, said, why not make our own game? Because they had played Tunnels and Trolls in the years before. So they sat down and made an own game, which was not based on Tunnels and Trolls, but many ideas from Tunnels and Trolls were used to make Das Schwarze Auge. So we suddenly had two competing games in Germany. The one was D&D, the translation from us, and the other was Das Schwarze Auge von Schmidt-Spiele. And now we're going a bit into the arcana of games. In those days, Fedes was very big. Fedes is a Nuremberg company, and they had gaming stores all over Germany. And they use the concept of rack jobbing. That means if you are a company, you buy rack space in a store, and then you can put your games, your boxes, your books, whatsoever, into these racks, and they are sold over that. And now comes why Das Schwarze Auge had better sales than D&D, because Schmidt-Spiele was a company who had puzzles and big boxes. So they had more rack space, and rack space for basically put anything in. On the other side, it was ISS had card games, and they had not so much space. They had only those small boxes, and so the D&D was, let's say, underrepresented in German stores. That's why DSR was the game that sold better.
So you said Vedes, the toy store?
DES, and they came from Nuremberg. And they were really huge in the 70s and 80s, before Toys R Us came.
Yes, I remember that as a kid growing up in Hanover in the 80s, going to Vedas and seeing Das Schwarze Auge there. Okay, so these were the first days. So now we are in the early 80s, I guess. When was Das Schwarze Auge first published?
I think it was 82 or 83. I'm not really sure. I've never been a Das Schwarze Auge player, because when Das Schwarze Auge came on the market, I was a veteran of role-playing, so I never took it seriously and stayed with my own games. I'm more a Traveller player.
Okay, we come to Traveller in a minute, but let's look at Midgard. So from this Abenteuer in Maghera, Midgard developed, and that was also published a time later, wasn't it?
Yeah, basically, I talked about the word Maghera, and they did something they called cultural simulation. That means the players had alter egos in this fantasy world Maghera, and those people played in a role-playing game themselves in the fantasy world. Perhaps you have heard about Wargamers World from Hugh Walker. That was the English title in the US. And Hugh Walker is in real life Hubert Strasse, and he was behind the fantasy serial Dragon in the early 70s and later Mythor in the late 70s. That was basically all developed by Hubert Strasse. And so because these novels existed, players had a real understanding of their world, because there had been books about it. And they also developed the world themselves. Because the thing is that it was multi-leveled. On the one hand, you had the Eternal Game, which was 2-meter diameter round game board with hexes. And on that, the countries fought against each other and also wrote history. There we had 2 campaigns. The one was Abenteuer in Maghera. That was the campaign by Jürgen Franke. And that later became, with huge influences of RuneQuest, Midgard. And then we had the Abenteuer in Ranabad campaign. And that, again, became the official rules that follow the Fantasy Club, and was used there. And that was released in 86 or 87 as Abenteuer in Maghera, the role-playing game. And these had culture modules for Ranabad, for Albion, for several. And I, as I said before, I played in both campaigns.
Midgard was published also in the mid-1980s, is that right?
No, I think 80 or 81. The first edition was A5 format, a little booklet. That was the first edition of Midgard. And that, as I said, was EBT, Empires of Battle Throne, and that's a RuneQuest.
As we all probably know, Das Schwarze Auge is still going on in Germany. Do you know about Midgard and different editions, how that developed?
Not really. I took part in the development in a way. It's a bit complicated, because the story behind the thing is that in Follow, we had, let's say, differences of opinion. Basically, there were 2 groups and they clashed massively. So massively that the whole fantasy club fell apart in 2 groups. And the one group was those who developed Midgard. That had nothing to do with the breaking apart of the club, but they were those people and they left the club. And inside the club, the original rules of EBT were continued to be used, and they influenced also RuneQuest, became a separate game. And this was called Abenteuer in Maghera. Then the 2 games went totally apart, and there was basically no connection between the 2. They had been the same rules in 78, but then, since the club broke apart, also the rule development broke apart.
Do both games still exist, or both groups, or what happened?
No, not really. The development of the internal rules for the club ended in the early 90s. And there was always proposals to make a 2.0 version, but it hasn't happened yet. And you can also, I think, you can't buy the game anymore because it hasn't been reprinted since the 80s. And Midgard then really became a professional game. In the 80s, Midgard was second to Das Schwarze Auge.
What I would also like to know about the early days, you talked about these clubs, SFCD and so on. Do you know when the first role-playing conventions happened?
Yeah, that was the one at Pentecost in 1979 in Wuppertal. That was really the first ever gaming convention in Germany. And while there were no role-playing games, there was more strategic games and so on, everyone who was on that convention was also a role player. You know, the thing is, role-playing games in those days were tiny. When I started, if there were 30 players, that's a high number. There were 20 or 30 people who did role-playing game in Germany, and nobody else knew about it. Gaming in those times was totally different from when it is today, not in the rules, but in the way, as I just said, there were about 20 to 30 players, and they came from all over Germany. So that meant that when we played in the campaign, we had to play over a weekend or in holidays or so, or in a long weekend, like Easter or so, which was great for playing, because people came from all over the country and you slept on a little couch at a friend in the town where the game was played. Today we would sit together on an evening and play a game, but this were really over a whole weekend. We all came on Fridays and left late on Sunday and drove back to wherever we came from. So in Marburg, where many of people studied, it was the ideal place to come together because Marburg is about in the center of Germany in those days, and everyone could travel a reasonable distance. And so the heart of early role-playing in Germany was Marburg, where we met usually in the back room of a pub. That was the Gaststätte Posingis. They had a butcher and the pub of the village where we played.
Just for our international listeners, because you mentioned Pentecost and Easter in Germany, it's a Saturday to Monday are 3 days, so that's a long weekend. You mentioned later you got more into Traveller. Can you maybe say a little bit about that?
As I said, there was this convention in Wuppertal, and I talked about Ludger Fischer before. I remember it as if it was yesterday. He came with that little black box with the red stripe and said, "This is the role-playing game of the future." Unintended, because it was a science fiction role-playing game for the future, but it was also the role-playing game for the future in gaming, because it was the first real science fiction role-playing game. And since the Imperium, which came much later, did not exist in those days, it was a generic science fiction role-playing game. So that with a little bit of imagination, you could adapt anything. You could play Star Wars with it. You could do anything was possible because the rules gave you the capability to do that. And that was something amazing. I myself, I come from Perry Rhodan. I was an avid reader. I started in 73 at the age of 13. And Perry Rhodan has always accompanied me through my whole life. I made computer games, I made board games, lots of things. So the idea to be able to play Perry Rhodan, the novels, with role-playing set was fantastic. That was everything I had dreamed of since I started reading those novels.
Perry Rhodan is a German science fiction series. I think it's the longest ongoing series in the world, and it has a very devoted fan base. And in the German science fiction and fantasy scene, it's very well known. And it has an English name, Perry Rhodan, but it's actually from Germany, just for the context.
A few points to that. Rhodan started in August 61 and has been published weekly since then. That means they are now at 3,100, I don't know, but every week since August 61, a new novel. They are very important for the German scene. There was a US edition in the 70s. I think it was the first 130 or so were published, 140. And they were translated by Wendyne Ackerman, the wife of Forrest Ackerman. Mr. Superfan was his nickname, and he was a very, very important person for the whole science fiction fandom from the 50s to the 90s. So, Traveller. I was in London in autumn of 79. It was in those days that in the last year before you finished high school or gymnasium, you usually made the whole class to abroad. And we went to London. So I bought Traveller exactly in the same week when Alien had its premiere. They had the premiere in the Odeon on Leicester Square. in London, and I was there, not in the premiere, but 2 or 3 days after the premiere. So Alien and Traveller started in the same week.
So this was the English edition of Traveller, and there was later also German translation. Were there any specific German products that came out in Germany?
No, everything was translated, and there was no, in a way, I was the editor of the official fanzine Explorer, which we had only 4 issues, but it was from Fantasy Productions, and that was fan-made material. I also translated a few Traveller into the Argo Gambit. That was my part of the German Traveller translation. And German Traveller, Werner Fuchs, was also a huge science fiction fan. And so he had the idea to contact Game Designers Workshop, Mark Miller, and the rest is history. So they made the German. And the funny thing was that the German quality of print and layout was much better than everything that came from the US. When the German edition came, the American Traveller material was still in the little black books, the A5 font, and German made A4 and had real covers from science fiction artists, which Traveller had no covers at all. There were only the black books with the colored stripe.
Yes, I got the first edition of German Traveller in a regular bookshop. I got it in the mid-1990s, so maybe 1995, and it made quite an impression on me because it looked like a regular book and had good artwork. Yeah.
Werner Fuchs also had a media agency. He could get any cover, any picture he wanted from the US, from the UK, through this agency. And German Traveller was, let's say, made much more professional than the US version, because Werner Fuchs was working with publishing houses here in Germany, and he had printer. He did this whole thing professionally, while GDW, Game Designers Workshop, was still very much a fan company in the early 80s. It's changed, of course, over the years, but in the beginning it was funny that the translation was better than the original in layout.
So now we're in the mid-1980s. Is there anything from the later development also that you want to talk about, or were you still involved there?
I had a very interesting career job in case of jobs, because in the 80s I worked for Fantasy Productions as translator and also in their store. Then I went to Welt der Spiele, who was one of the biggest wholesalers of role-playing game in the 90s. And then I had my own store in my hometown, Siegen, in the 90s. So I knew every aspect of the gaming business, from production, wholesales, up to sale in stores. And in the 90s, sadly, came when many companies went bankrupt because of Magic: The Gathering. It was terrible. At first, we couldn't get enough of it because it sold like crazy. I've never seen that with anything else, that the people were really standing, waiting in front of the store till we opened, because someone had said that we would get a new shipment on that day. In role-playing games, this had never happened before. So the problem was, when we got Magic, all the kids spent all their money on Magic cards and had no money left to play any role-playing material. And that worldwide led to a lot of companies becoming defunct, like Game Designers Workshop, Traveller. They did go bankrupt, but they closed because they knew that with the downscaling of sales, they couldn't survive. There was no chance for them to make a living of it. And so they closed the company down, which is very sad. I was a huge Traveller fan. And suddenly hearing that the company had gone out of business, that was heavy stuff. And then, let's say, the 90s were among the worst days of a role-playing game. And then came computers and PDF. And with PDF format, that was suddenly the business returned. And so many small new companies with good ideas and good games and good rules came up, so that today we have had a renaissance in role-playing game, which I wouldn't have believed possible in the 90s. And that's all only thanks to PDF and to publishing material, so that basically everyone could produce in the same quality that only big companies could do in the indies.
My last question would be, with your experiences of the German gaming scene and also having traveled to the UK and reading the English books, do you see a difference between role-playing in Germany and in the English-speaking countries?
Not today. The start of a role-playing game, as I told you, in the 70s, that was totally different because we didn't really play for fun. Okay, we played for fun, but we also had a bigger idea behind the whole thing about simulating a whole world, a fantasy world. That was our part. But then, when the games came out, there was also a difference because Schmidt-Spiele was able to bring their games, their products, into the gaming market of Germany. I told about Fedes. And so they had a much larger base than the US had. Because US, many games in the early days were sold about over mail order and in small gaming stores, but not the big stores like WH Smith. Nobody would touch role-playing games at first. That's all changed over the decades. But in the beginning, the German role-playing scene was a big step ahead of the US market because they started selling their products in the real chain stores. So it was easier for them to reach the people. So let's say the start in Germany was faster than the start in the US. What took a decade in the US took only 2 or 3 years in Germany because of that step ahead. And I think today there's no difference. And yes, there is one difference. Difference between German players in the meaning of language players. That means people who only use German language material and those who make the step to English material, who can speak English. This is a real difference. Those people who prefer English rules and have access to the world of role-playing game, the world of role-playing game in that sense, and those who stay in the German language and don't play any English stuff. That's a huge difference because in that regard, the German market is much smaller. For when you can only use German rules or don't speak English. I think that is the biggest difference.
Now, you can't talk about the German role-playing scene without talking about Das Schwarze Auge. This literally translates to the black eye, but in German, that's not what you say when you get hit in the face. To make it less confusing, the official English name is actually the dark eye. But you later hear some interviewees who will just call it black eye. So don't get mixed up.
My name is Robert, and I got into role-playing games when I was still 11. Yeah, so quite young actually. So I was a Boy Scout when I was young, and some of my friends, they went to summer camp, and our group leaders, they were heavily role players, and when the others came back, they brought role play back from that summer camp, and then we all started. But in perspective, I would say that we were always role playing, even when we were doing our Legos or with our stuffed animals or so as children. It was already role play back then, maybe, and it just got more formal once we got into tabletop RPGs.
And which games were those?
So we started with The Dark Eye, as it's called in English, Das Schwarze Auge in German, which is still until today one of my most appreciated systems, and where I don't like the word expert. Let's say I'm quite deep into it and into the community, and I have some very good friends, so we have strong ties to the community there. So yeah, I would say that there's a lot to talk about that system specifically, but of course later we got into so many different kinds of role-playing systems that we all tried out, not only Germans ones. So I played World of Darkness as much as The Dark Eye, Shadowrun a lot, GURPS, all that stuff basically.
So you're involved with the DSA Archiv?
Yeah, we call ourselves the DSA Sammler Archiv, so the Dark Eyes Collectors Archive. And I would say what we do is roleplay archaeology. Yeah, so it started. So a good friend of mine, he has one of the biggest collections from the Dark Eye, and he started not playing in 1984, he started collecting in 1984. And so he has tremendous amount of stuff, unique items, special items, lost items, whatever. And I got kind of inspired with him to also broaden my collection, because we also, of course, knew other collectors. So we thought like, yeah, well, we should not just keep it in our shelves, we should make it public. And so, of course, we use social media to bring out all the stories that we have and all the rare items, to present them, and to also, at least I do it, to formally put it in a list. So my big goal would be to have an actual archive or a museum dedicated to roleplay or to the Dark Eye and stuff like that. I mean, there's a bunch of collectors out there, but I think at some point the community has to bring that more on an institutional level. And well, I think it can only start on a base like this, what we do. Because of that project, we discovered, like archaeologists, a lot of old stuff, and we're constantly in communication and exchange with each other and digging up old stuff, old stories, old items. And for me, a focus is advertising and print runs, editions of books and all that stuff. Yeah, so I got a heavy collection wherever I am. I can get hold of a book. I look inside and I try to get every print run and edition of the stuff that I collect, because that is my focus. I like the perspective of the publication history. Yeah, so like the earthly history. So of course I'm into the game as well, but for me, our real world aspect of it and the publishing, the business history behind it, that's what I'm particularly interested in.
Okay, let's pick up on that. So when was the first Dark Eye product published?
In 1984, it started all, even though I was not there, of course, but it started with a plan of Schmidt-Spiele, one of the biggest German board game companies, to publish D&D, a German version of it. And that didn't happen. There's other people who can tell that story better, but Schmidt-Spiele decided, well, if we cannot have Dungeons and Dragons, then we will do our own roleplay system. And they were in contact with some creators of games and roleplay systems. And so they told them, guys, write us a roleplay system. And they did it in 6 weeks. And that was Ulrich Kiesow, Werner Fuchs, and Hans-Joachim Alpers, 3 authors, basically, and businessmen. Yeah, and that's how they started it. And then, because Schmidt-Spiele worked with a big publishing company together, so they had like the full power of marketing and brought it into the German market. There's a famous saying of the CEO of Schmidt-Spiele. He said, we want to blow D&D off the market, to thrive them away, so that there's nothing left of them. And that power, how they got into the German market, I think that is the reason why the Dark Eye was so successful in Germany back at that time, and why it kept that success for quite a long time.
So I haven't really followed the Dark Eye. So you said was successful. I think it was first the biggest game in Germany, but has that changed over time?
Yeah, well, so back in that time, we have to think about that certain books, or the rule books and the boxes that came out, whether were sold 50,000, 60,000. There's always the number of 100,000 books that were sold, but that's not the core publication. That's like the first 2 boxes and 6 books together. They sold 100,000 pieces in the first year or so. So it's quite a lot. And of course, we're far away from that number today. And I would say up until the 2000s, the market share of the Dark Eye was about 50% to 2/3 in Germany, slowly declining. And nowadays, I think it's much less, maybe 20, 25%, still big, but it's kind of an old man's game. It has become, that. The modern stuff, of course, is D&D. Pathfinder was very big, but now the Dark Eye is one of the few big roleplay systems, but it's not the only big role-playing system anymore. And of course, it was always like a battle with D&D, even back in the 80s. There were like 2 heavily divided groups, the D&D players and the Dark Eye players.
I've had some episodes with Central Europe and Southeastern Europe, and they all know about the Dark Eye. Are you aware of translations? Because there's an English version, but I think there's also a Dutch one, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so even back in the 80s, it started that there was a French version, an Italian version, and a Dutch version. And the Dutch version was the longest running, I think, up until the end of the 80s, probably even until the 90s, I think. Now that I think of the publications, it has to be also start of the 90s, but then there were no new publications in that time. yeah, I think that is the reason, because there was always like a core players group, and they stayed with that even when there was no new publications, because they knew, oh well, it's still played in Germany, and some of them learned German or so and were still active and followed the Dark Eye. That is one reason. There was actually also the rights to publish it in English were also sold in 1985, I think, to a big English publishing company, but they never published it actually. And so the first English version came out now with the fifth edition. Oh no, with the fourth edition actually. There were 3 books, but absolutely not successful in the beginning of the 2000s. That was, yeah, well, it was 3 books and that's it. Yeah, so it didn't work out. And now the 5th edition is stronger, but it's also, I would say, a niche project. But still, in Europe, there's now a lot of different translations. There's Spanish, I think. There's plans. I'm not sure if it's even published yet. The Portuguese version in Brazil. There's like a fan translation in Russian, but that's only one person from what I think. So there's a lot. And we have a lot of successful video games that always keep the name, The Dark Eye, alive. So even from the 90s on, I think that is one of the many reasons why it's successful still all over Europe. And it has this particularly European feeling, which is quite different from American fantasy. And I think that's also why it's very popular among Europeans in general.
Yeah, that was actually what I was going to ask you next. So what is the difference between the Dark Eye and these American games like D&D or others?
The best way that I described is it feels German, it feels European. So you have German names, of course. You have relation to particular German and European regions. Yeah, for example, there's one region in the world of the Dark Eye, which is called Aventuria, that is oriented in the North Sea coast of Germany and the Netherlands, for example. And there you can relate it a lot to. You have the Vikings, of course. You cannot always make a comparison. And a lot of people would say like, oh no, that's not the same. If you say the Nivesen, for example, they are related to the traditional tribe in northern Scandinavia or so. No. But you can see the parallels. You have the Bornland, which is kind of like a Russian vibe, has it, a feeling to that. And when I look at American fantasy, of course, I see the inspirations where it got from the real world connections, but not in that naturally grown way as it's done in the Dark Eye. And you have like an old empire which is related to the Romans. You have a regional connection to a desert area, to desert tribe, to desert people, which would be the Muslim world or the correspondence of that. You have culturally mixed areas like, for example, medieval Spain, where you have also the Islamic world and the Christian world coming together. And you have these influences also in some areas of the Dark Eye. You have a pirate setting, which is weirdly a mixture of pirate setting and Roman Empire, which makes it quite interesting in jungle tribes. And yeah, so I think these all makes up a quite European thing. And you have the classical themes, dragons, dwarves, all that, which you also find in American fantasy. Yeah, but you're lacking all these other completely made up stuff, I would say. Yeah, that is what, for me at least, generates this very unique European approach to fantasy, which you can find in Tolkien or so also. So many connections, but yeah.
I also got the feeling that the Dark Eye is more human-centered and has less magic than D&D. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say so. It's fans always debate about, is it low fantasy, is it high fantasy? I don't like this categorization, but it is human-centered. We call it in German Fentelalter, which is kind of like a mixed word, yeah, between fantasy and medieval age. Yeah, so it's on the brink of these two things, and you can easily have quite a mundane campaign about it. Mundane stories, very basic stories, and even magic is a very unique thing in the world, actually. But on the other hand, it's full of stuff like that. Yeah, so it's a bit more down to earth. And of course, what makes it very attractive for someone who's 12 or 14 or 16, it has much more naked people and much more sex than American roleplay systems had at that time. Yeah, so it was always very, very open in that regard, because that is in Europe, nobody cares about having like an illustration with a naked woman. Yeah, so that's totally okay to have it for a 12 or 14-year-old person to show it to them. It's nobody cares. Yeah, and for an American, this is quite different. And The Dark Eye has a very particularly humor. It's quite, I wouldn't say offensive, but it's very straightforward. Also in the writing style they used and the way they approach the world, and they have kind of like a not very sophisticated humor, but sometimes also very thought out. So it's also this mixture, but it's obviously that there's people who just want to make fun of the real world when demons are just anagrams of German politicians or so. Yeah. Of course, it's ridiculous. It makes up the very specific vibe of The Dark Eye.
So speaking of these raunchy pictures on the covers, because I also remember them as a child, I just recently found out that many of the iconic Dark Eye covers were done by a Turkish immigrant, actually. That quite surprised me.
Yes, Uğurcan Yüce. And for me, every picture of him is amazing. When I bought books as a 12 or 13-year-old in the bookstore, I choose them just by the cover illustration. I didn't care about anything else. Yeah, actually, the cover illustrations have very little to do with the actual content of the books or even with the world. Yeah, they show things that absolutely doesn't exist due to the very bad communication between Schmidt-Spiele and the authors and the cover artists and everything. It's a general problem. But for me, this very, I would call it 50s or 60s style. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone of the people who's listening knows the movie Prince Valiant, Prince Eisenherz from the 50s. Yeah, or I think from the 50s or 60s with Robert Wagner and a lot of famous actors from that time. And there's also Vikings in that movie. And if you look at these Vikings, they look exactly like all the cover people from Uğurcan Yüce. Yeah, so they're absolutely the same. And I think he took a lot of inspiration from the comics of that time and from the general approach to fantasy. Yeah, I mean, it's not like today where we can just generate every image we want. Yeah, back at that time, every especially colorized image was something special. Every illustration in a book, yeah, was a gateway to the fantasy, to the imagination. And so all these images, and up until today, when I look at them, stories come into my mind. And I think that's why they are so iconic, why they are so good, at least to me. Yeah? Some people don't like it because they say it's unrealistic or so. That's not the point for me. For me, it's I look at them and I see stories. It activates my mind, I would say. Yeah, it drives my imagination. And that's why they are so wonderful. And Uğurcan Yüce, he made a lot of them. And there's also another Turkish artist, Ertuğrul Edirne. He still lives in Germany. He also has a similar style to Yüce. They were also friends. And he also made less cover artworks, but also some of them. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But yeah, he has a similar style. And it's also very nice to look at his covers. Yeah. But for me, I'm one of the person who love that style. It's amazing.
So coming from the history and the artwork, maybe for the listeners who don't know the system, and I know we don't have the time to explain our system, but maybe just like the basic resolution system of the Dark Eye, just a short overview of how that looks like.
Yeah, one word, the system is quite bad up until today. It always was, and it's not the reason to play the game. It's based on attributes. You roll a d20 and try to roll under your attribute number, which causes a lot of problems. And skills are done by a so-called 3d20 test, which is very complicated. You roll 3 attribute tests and you modify every single of your rolls with your skill rating. I mean, it's still just elementary school mathematics, but it is still quite a challenge for people who are not like maybe very gifted with mathematics. Just to do that on the fly, it's super complicated. And the fighting system is again different from that. Yeah, you also roll the d20 to make your attack rolls and your defense rolls, but they're based on different values, and to calculate them, it's very complicated. In general, it's super many different game mechanics for every aspect of it. Yeah, it's quite German, quite administrative. I always say, imagine a very conservative German government ministry and think of they want to create a role-play system, game mechanics The dark eye is what came out of it. Yeah, so that's always what I say. And the new edition, the goal was to be easier in the 5th edition, but to be honest, it's not. It's still very complicated.
Have there been any attempts to adapt other systems to it? Is there any system that would work better?
Yeah, a lot of them. There's, of course, D&D. There's World of Darkness. I mean, there's many of them in the internet. There's fan-made systems. There's homebrew rules. Some of them even very famous. Some of them actually published book by the publishing company of the Dark Eye. They even published the homebrew rule systems sometimes. But I think for the majority of the players, these are irrelevant. The problem is with the Dark Eye that the rules heavily are connected with the world. It's called the fantastic realism. That's how we call it in German. And it describes the fact that the way a rule mechanic works is actually also the way the things work in the world. So if you change the rules of something, you change the world. And that's a huge problem because you cannot just change rules or make them better because that would heavily affect plot, like events that happened in the past wouldn't make sense anymore because you would say, oh, well, with that game mechanic, that wouldn't happen in the world, yeah, because it would be solved in another way. And that is a big problem for the Dark Eye, and I don't see a solution for that, sadly, actually. Yeah, so I'm saying a lot of things that might people drive away from it. Yes.
So just to make that clear, so another difference to D&D would be that it's just one setting, and it's a living setting since the 1980s, isn't it?
Yeah, that's one aspect we haven't touched yet. What makes the Dark Eye even more special is that from the late 80s onwards, not from the absolute start, but from that time onward, the whole world is developing, constantly developing. It has a living history and it's an ongoing history created together with the fandom. There is a monthly magazine or a 2-month magazine that comes out. It's an in-game magazine, yeah, and so it describes the in-game events, and there's like a constant development of the plot of events. It has history, it has events, and you can say, okay, I play in a certain year in the history that we have, and I know, okay, this person is alive, this person is not, this is what happens, and all that stuff, yeah, so that makes up a lot of it. That is what makes actually very interesting. You can live the history of the world, but again, of course, it's a bit of a challenge to get into it, yeah, because you cannot just say, oh, well, let's play it, yeah? Because then you come to a corner and there's this duke or whatever, king or so, and you cannot just do with him what you want because he plays an important role in the story of the world. And you cannot just kill him or do something with him. That's hard. Yeah? So for me, that's one of the biggest aspects. And that's also why I love it so much, because you have these, it's like a soap opera. Yeah, I would say it's a fantasy world soap opera. We have these characters and we follow them. We have the children of the emperor, yeah, and we followed all from the time where they were born now until they're grown ups and ruling the Midden Realm, as it's called, yeah. So it's our personal soap opera. That's not my thought or my interpretation. I saw it somewhere else, but I think that's a good description.
So with the archive, you said you're collecting rare things. What would be the most obscure things you have there?
For me, what's very obscure is certain advertising from the 80s or so, where they present a role-play group that basically looks like a lunch break office group. Yeah, they're playing there in the conference room or so and stuff like that. Super weird stuff. The description from that time, marketing text or so. For me, that's very obscure. But when you think of merchandise that exists, well, today we have bed sheets with the Dark Eye. Yeah, we have socks with the symbols of the gods of the Dark Eye. We have basically any kind of merchandise product that you can imagine now exists. And in the old days, it was different. Yeah, but there's so many things. And of course, some collection things that we have maybe are not what you would show. So very personal items from some of the makers. Yeah, some of them are already dead. Some have made their own personal stories where you have maybe characters from them or stories from them that they never published and that give quite a deep insight to their own thing where you would not say that they wanted to have published or so. And so these are maybe some kind of obscure items that you have. There's also personal items, of course, like convention tickets from the Dark Eye conventions where I went or so. It's less obscure, but more personal. But there's not this super weird item where you would say, well, that is super weird. Yeah, there's colors for the Dark Eye miniatures, and they have some names that you could not do today. For example, they have a color. Green is named after the goddess, which has the main color of green. Well, that's easy, but you can imagine what they used for the color of brown. Yeah, so that is something that you could not make a comparison again. They related it to skin color of certain ethnicities in the Dark Eye, and that's something that you couldn't bring out a product like that anymore. Yeah, so of course, these are historical artifacts where you would say, well, that's kind of weird from our perspective today.
Maybe coming back to more mainstream products, there are also a lot of novels in the Dark Eye setting. Do you know how many there are and how popular they are at the moment?
There's around 200 novels, depends how you count them, because some of them have published double or in different forms or so, but about 200 novels is what we have at the time. And yeah, some of the authors of the Dark Eye, mostly Bernhard Hennen, he started as an author for the Dark Eye novels and adventure and campaign settings, and now he's the best-selling German fantasy author. Yeah, so he just published together with someone else a book series of 12 books set in the Dark Eye world. Now it's completed, but it was till now the best-running German fantasy novel series. In general, his works are very famous and also widely translated, I think. Yeah, not only his works from the Dark Eye, but also others. All the others, the novels, I think they're just within the Dark Eye world. But some of the authors, they started as Dark Eye authors and they turned different. So there's Sasha Stanisic. He started as a Dark Eye author, and he's now, I think last or 2 years ago, he got the biggest German literature prize. Yeah, so people can change their career, obviously, and they start in the Dark Eye. Yes? But when you look at the books itself from the Dark Eye, they're not very famous. They used to be famous. They used to be in every railway station bookstore or so, but not anymore.
There's probably still a lot more to say, but is there anything you'd like to add? Anything important we left out?
Yes. So if anyone is interested in the world of the Dark Eye, my recommendation is play the video game Drakensang. Yeah, or Drakensang, I'm not sure how it's called. It is classic RPG, available on Steam and Good Old Games or so on PC. It still runs up until today, and it is absolutely amazing in showing what the atmosphere and how the world is. It has an amazing story. The game is super fun. It's classic RPG, of course, so you got to get a bit into it. But if you want to know what is the Dark Eye, what is the special atmosphere of it, why is it the way it is, then play these two games. Also, the successor, The River of Time, is even better. So maybe you want to start with that because it's actually a prequel to the story. So start with that. Amazing games. So anyone who is interested and you don't have access to the books or you cannot speak German, but you want just to know about something about the world, play these games. They're like 10 years old or even 15 years old, a bit outdated, but they still look, for me, they're fine. Yes, it's no problem. So that would be my advice to everyone. There's more video games, but these are absolutely brilliant.
So thank you for listening to the World of RPGs, but there is more. I uploaded all 3 parts simultaneously, so just go ahead to part 2, which is all about those popular games from America. No, not just the D20-based ones. To end this episode, let's do something new, and that's a pre-recorded promo for a German podcast about one of the games we'll also talk in the next part of episode 15. So this is for the German listeners. Enjoy. Wir sind ein paar Chamas, die früher an den Schatten gelaufen sind. Damals, als wir uns noch über die Induktionspads mit unseren Smartguns verbinden mussten. Zu Beginn der ersten Vitos-Welle 2020, ungefähr zu dem Zeitpunkt, als Ares die neue Ares Predator 6 auf den Markt gebracht hat, haben wir uns dazu entschlossen, das alte Team wieder zusammenzutrommeln. Wir haben die alten Kontakte wiederbelebt, hier und da ein paar Jobs übernommen, nichts Großes. Aber dann führte das eine zum anderen und ehe wir es uns versahen, steckten wir knietief im Dreck. Und irgendwie war Wegrennen keine Option mehr. Hier sind unsere Aufzeichnungen von dem Insekten-Scheiße spuckenden Tsunami, der über uns hinwegzog, Anfang der 70er in Berlin. Die Anfänge unseres Comebacks haben wir nicht aufgezeichnet. Aber als die Situation immer brenzliger wurde, haben wir Record gedrückt.
Vielleicht hilft es euch ja, den einen oder anderen Fehler, den wir gemacht haben, nicht zu wiederholen.
Willkommen zu unserem Shadowrun 6 Actual Play Podcast. Wir halten uns an die Regeln, bis wir es nicht mehr tun. Hit Like und Subscribe.
Hallo User, hier spricht deine Podcast-KI. Entschuldige die Unterbrechung. Du musst dir keine Sorgen machen. Der Spielleiter wird sich an die Regeln halten.
Also, der Status erst Podcast. Lade die erste Folge jetzt gleich herunter. Verfügbar überall, wo es Podcasts gibt. Wir sehen uns in den Schatten.